Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Habitat for Humanity's Plus You discussion, where we will be talking about the impact of past pandemics on driving innovations and exploring global housing innovations that may arise from the challenges we have faced amid COVID-19. I'm Lisanne Kuster, Associate Director of Entrepreneurship and Innovation for Habitat's Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter, and I'm the Global Lead for Shelter Tech. I know, it's a long title. It's really an honor to be your host today. We are very much looking forward to a fruitful conversation with our panelists, who I'm excited to introduce to you all. Gayatri Datar is the co-founder and CEO of earthen, a social enterprise that aims to make living conditions healthier for the world's poor, first by eliminating dirt floor. A study conducted actually showed that replacing a dirt floor with concrete that has the potential to reduce parasitic infections by 78%. earthen developed and sells a floor that is 80% cheaper than cement. Gayatri holds an MBA ID from the Harvard Kennedy School and an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. She's an Echoing Green Fellow, a Stanford Social Innovation Fellow, and the Forbes 30 Under 30 recipient. Charlie Ligeti. He is a published author, serial entrepreneur, former licensed real estate agent, and commercial real estate banker. He is the managing director of the Housing Innovation Collaborative, an action-oriented, non-profit housing R&D platform based in Los Angeles. The collaborative highlights the next generation of construction, finance, and policy solutions to address the housing affordability crisis. Charlie holds an MBA from the University of Southern California. Andre Nogueira is an associate researcher and instructor at Harvard University, co-founder of the Design Laboratory, or D-Lab, at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health. At the D-Lab, Andre and his team apply design methods and frameworks to intractable public health problems to develop evidence-based solutions that can adapt behaviors in order to enhance an individual's well-being and ultimately improve people's lives. Andre holds a PhD in design from the IIT Institute of Design, a master in geography, cities, and architecture from Escola de Ciudad. Same Vechba is the global director for the World Bank Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience, and Land Global Practice. The practice has over $30 billion in lending commitments and over 400 staff. Same holds a PhD in urban planning from Harvard University and has 25 experience in urban development, land, housing, disaster risk management, infrastructure, and sustainable development. He speaks Arabic, French, English, and Portuguese, and co-authored several of the World Bank flagship publications. He is also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Cities and Urbanization. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you as well to the audience today. The panel will be taking questions directly from you, ladies and gentlemen, behind the screens later in the hour. So please drop your comments and questions in the chat box as we go. Today, we're here to talk about innovation and the impact of COVID-19 on how we design, we build, and experience our homes around the world. The relationship between health and housing is strong and clear. A healthy home can be a prescription that provides both immunity and resilience. A decent home may prevent asthma or lead poisoning, and an affordable home can prevent stunted growth and unnecessary hospitalization. And to help us kick off this important conversation, I'd like to share a brief introduction from Ron Terwilliger, Chairman Emeritus of Trammell Crow Residential Company, Chairman Emeritus of the Habitat for Humanity International Board of Directors, and current Chair of the Advisory Board for Habitat's Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter.
Disruption has long been a catalyst for innovation. It was with this recognition that we created the Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter almost 5 years ago. building upon decades of Habitat's work in this area. Habitat's Terwilliger Center fosters more inclusive and better functioning housing markets globally. A strong housing market is one that has products and services to meet the needs of families at all economic levels. A strong housing market is one that embraces and enables innovation. Pandemics are a significant disruptive force, as we've all experienced in different ways this past year. For far too many, COVID-19 has brought tragedy, and for all of us, has brought significant changes. But we also know that past pandemics, from global tuberculosis and cholera outbreaks to the 1918 flu, prompted significant change and innovation within the housing sector. From the development of indoor plumbing and boiler heaters to new design standards for apartments and multifamily homes, these public health crises fundamentally reshaped the function and safety of housing today. In a sector desperately in need of change, we should be asking ourselves, what innovations will come out of this pandemic to reshape what housing can look like for millions of families? Let's seize opportunity in crisis and nurture these innovations that can help people improve the places they call home. Because let's not forget, housing itself is a positive disruptive force, one that improves health, financial and educational outcomes for families, while promoting economic recovery for countries around the world.
I'd like to start with you, Andre. As Ron mentioned in his introduction, past pandemics have actually helped shape our built environment and how we design for a healthier, more livable space. Can you maybe tell us more about the historical relationship and intersection between housing design and public health?
Sure. So thank you for the opportunity. This is going to be a great conversation. So as we all experience today, but also throughout history, pandemics have changed how we live, learn, work, and play. They have been times with high level of uncertainty, where people were searching for new and more relevant questions than actually definitive answers. There were powerful people throughout history investing in new initiatives that were audacious in their purpose and exploitative work. So we could look in many places and many times throughout history, but today I'm going to jump on that cholera hench that was presented before and bring us to 1850s in the UK. So in 1854, the reason why I'm bringing this is because developments at that time in design and public health continue to inform how we think about housing. So in 1854, Dr. John Snow, one of the founding fathers of epidemiology, which is the field that focuses on distribution and control of diseases, rather than studying cholera from labs, he actually went and observed people experiencing them, marking those experiences on a street map in Soho. And that allowed him to identify patterns even before they could actually be understood. And he concluded that cholera was coming from polluted wells, not from the air, as he was doing. 1888, Florence Nightingale, one of the mothers of modern nursing, was actually observing soldiers coming from the battlefield in healthcare facilities and developing insights that would then be combined with her statistical analysis to form forms of data visualization. She wanted to convince the parliament that most of the death in battlefields could actually be prevented. Now, at about the same time that these two were developing new approaches that are very much necessary to respond to the new questions, Henry Cole, which was at that a member of what we call now the Royal Society of Arts, was actually exploring, working with Prince Albert to explore new ways of living. So he had this idea that artists and craftsmanship could work together with industry leaders to develop new ways of living. They came together. Their collaboration led to the Great Exhibition. More than 6 million people came together to see more than 100,000 objects. And part of that experience was Prince Albert model for dwelling. So people visit this place where he believed that new products should actually improve people's lives. And so when people were visiting, they experienced concrete floors, they experienced new type of brick that was not as porous and was actually cheaper to be made. And they also noticed that there were dedicated stair wheels for each family. Those are concerns, moral concerns raised by social workers. Now, at the end of the tour, people extended, they could talk to consultants about financial models, about ways of work. So this was the first manifestation of designers contributing to actually social innovation at a large scale, and the big step towards formalizing the design practice that was before craftsmanship. Now, these examples, they generated standards that continue to influence how we think about housing today. But today, the speed, scale, and scope of housing has changed, right? And while we actually have accelerated our capability to produce and sell housing to the larger numbers of people around the world, our understanding about people's daily lives and patterns of daily life has reduced, right? What that has caused is that many of the models that we have today are sustained by complex ecosystem of stakeholders and financial models that tend to respond more to markets than actually to people. So it feels like today we can make any housing project, but we just don't know which one to use, right? So that's a significant challenge that we have today. Our understanding of health has also expanded. We know that the difference between housing and home, and that an unhealthy home can lead to chronic diseases, can lead to trauma, right? And we know that health goes beyond infrastructural plans and high quality material in the built environment to embrace cognitive, social, cultural, and emotional factors. So these uncertainty, right, bags new approaches for today, right? And we know that the future will be different than the past. We just don't know what ways, right? But what we actually do know today that we really desperately need, like at that time, audacious initiatives that are ambitious in their speed, scale, and scope, but also in the optimism. So
thank you, Andre. Thank you, Andre. You brought me actually to the next topic, right? Or to the next person also talking on this panel, Charlie. You spoke a little bit about speed, that nowadays we are faster also with innovations. We need to cross the gap between like historical intersections also to the future. And you said, however, speed is faster, but still it takes quite a lot of time also in how these industries have new innovations. Charlie, how is your perspective on how should the 2030, the future look like in terms of like in the housing sectors and homes? How will it change?
Well, great. Well, thank you for the question, Liz. To piggyback actually nicely on Andre's point about public health and pandemics of the past or whatever. I often make the same sort of analogy with the housing crisis that we have a housing crisis, and the outcome is that we have a housing affordability crisis for people all the way up into the middle class, like 120, 140% AMI, people that are firefighters, teachers, they're paying way too much on housing or commuting 2 hours each way in places like Los Angeles. And so they have a sort of housing crisis continuum that is also present on the fact that we have 70,000 unsheltered people living on our streets. And so there's a lot of people that are suffering from this shortage of housing. And so kind of like I would say one of the key problems that we're trying to address with the Housing Innovation Collaborative is creating a platform that showcases new solutions purely focused on how we scale housing production for underserved communities. And it's kind of like the pandemic, where the only way to stop the pandemic, and this might be controversial, is with a vaccine. It is how you end, and so you sort of need to increase the supply of vaccine. And so like in the housing crisis, we're still sort of in those early days where we haven't really figured out how to mass manufacture housing to serve everybody. And so it goes out to sort of like kind of following the market forces where, 92% of the housing that we've produced over the past decade in places like Los Angeles has been for 150% AMI and above. So like sort of that luxury high-end housing market. And so I kind of look at this as like, we haven't solved the problem of mass manufacturing the vaccine to our crisis, which is housing of all types for all different populations. And so, but kind of how we're looking at this is how do we scale new housing solutions, for scaling production for sort of everyone from, those that are living on the streets that are experiencing homelessness, that don't have a home or don't have a house, all the way through to the sort of permanent housing solutions that we need to build in order to densify our communities in sort of a sustainable way that allows the communities to be more inclusive. And so we sort of are working on various campaigns that try to figure out, using Los Angeles as a model, because we're the epicenter of the unsheltered homelessness population in the United States. We have 70,000 people living on our streets, and we have the largest number of super commuters in the world that travel 2 hours each way. 10% of the entire U.S. population that spends more than 3 hours a day in commuting in a car is coming to downtown Los Angeles to work. And so, we are sort of using this city as a testing bed to sort of, how do you unlock some of those really gnarly housing production challenges out there? And sort of, our platform is showcasing a lot of, like, I guess, like you said at the beginning, the next generation of these different designs. And, what we're seeing is if you break down the silos of, like, in the emergency shelter world, for example, we are trying to collapse all the different silos between those that work really in emergency response in a shelter crisis. So like at the beginning of the pandemic, the headline news was that, the mayor couldn't figure out or find shelter fast enough, given that we had this acute public health crisis of 70,000 people living on the streets. We were popping up cots in convention centers. We called up the U.S. Navy and sent in USNS Mercy to provide 1,000 beds, to get people off the streets. And so you sort of like were confronted with this question that we're always confronted with, and like one disaster after another is we as a society don't know how to make housing now in a post-disaster crisis scenario, and we haven't really figured out how to make long-term housing either. And so we sort of looking at those two fields and sort of gathering and showcasing ideas of whether, there's new solutions out there coming from the refugee crisis world, or coming from, the forest fighters sort of on the front lines of how they're popping up these camps to fight forest fires in California, to FEMA recovery response, and sort of breaking down these different silos of like, there's a lot of different experts out there that are very good at either doing rapid response after disaster, or in the case of homelessness, literally deploying thousands of transitional shelters everywhere to just end homelessness. Like we could literally do it in the next 90 days if we wanted to.
Jaime, I would like to continue with you. Again, we will hear later on about the entrepreneurs having difficulties and facing challenges, but so do low-income families, right, in developing countries, and they're trying to build and improve homes incrementally. What lessons can we take actually from like disaster risk reduction efforts to apply to the housing challenges resulting from the pandemic?
Thank you, Lisanne. So I think we have learned a lot of lessons from the pandemic. We've also learned a lot of lessons from disaster risk management practice in general. as well as from years of practicing housing policy. So let me share with you some of those key lessons learned. From resilience and disaster risk management, the biggest lessons we've learned is that it pays off to invest ex ante in risk reduction. So in the case of housing, it would be investing in good housing construction. We know that $1 invested in risk reduction saves us later on $4 to $7 in post-disaster reconstruction and recovery. And we know that the biggest asset in post-disaster needs assessment that we do in terms of damages is housing. You know, the biggest private asset. Obviously, public infrastructure also tends to face lots of damages. So this is what we've learned from resilience, you know, which is the build better before rather than build back better, which is our big motto, which is obviously still important. The second lesson that we've learned from housing and the built environment is that from a pandemic standpoint, poor housing quality, poor built environment quality, especially places where density becomes overcrowding, like slums and informal settlements, have translated into a risk of contagion. So it's not just about the unit and its quality, it's also about the neighborhood, that it matters. Density, proximity, amenities, livability, and so on. What did we learn from housing? We've learned that it's a key sector, not just to tackle a recovery post-pandemic, but also to tackle the other key structural crises that we face, like climate change and the inequity crisis. We've learned that basically the pandemic has revealed the structural inequalities that exist within our cities. And we've also learned that, you know, years of housing subsidies have showed that it goes to new housing construction, with usually ignoring where people live, like slums, informal settlements that could be improved. Whereas if you invested in improving the places where people are currently living, you will not just achieve inclusion and resilience, but also decarbonization. So what do we do at the World Bank? We have a comprehensive approach to tackling the housing sector. First, it combines the curative and the preventive. Curative means fixing living conditions where people are, slum upgradings, informal settlement upgrading. The preventive meaning enabling access to affordable land and housing so that you can prevent future slum formation. We also approach the demand and the supply side in an integrated fashion. And then and only then, after we've lowered the cost of housing production to the cheapest that the formal sector can produce, and after we've boosted demand as much as we can, we then introduce housing subsidies so that we don't end up subsidizing inefficiencies in the market. And then we have an approach that combines segmentation and housing solutions. Now, this translates into some specific programs. One of them particularly relevant to this conversation is our Resilient Housing Retrofit Program. We use technology through machine learning, drones, and cameras mounted on cars to create a three-dimensional image of the city. And via machine learning, we try to identify structures that are at risk of collapse, either from an earthquake or a cyclone. It's the soft story structures, etc., which we then match with surveys on the ground. And through our pilot, we've discovered that our algorithms actually enable us to detect 85 to 90% of buildings that are really subject to collapse, as corroborated by the surveys on the ground. And then we start working with the government to introduce an incentive program that incentivizes homeowners to basically improve their housing. If building regulations is a challenge in terms of the inefficiency of being able to accommodate density in the most valuable land, then you'll have particular challenges and so on as far as infrastructure, subsidies, and housing finance and construction finance are concerned. So that value chain is where the various players in the international community will need to come in. Entities like the World Bank, international finance institutions will be able to invest on both enabling the supply, but also boosting the demand. It's the housing finance markets, whether it's microfinance, mortgage markets, liquidity facilities. So being able to work across that value chain. But other entities will be able to innovate, to bring technologies, will be able to support on the policy front in terms of subsidy policy and so on and so forth. So being able to work as the international development community on both the supply side, the demand side, the subsidy side, and along the value chain will become critical to being able to have the types of outcomes that we want. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Seme. Gayatri, I hope you're there.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Fantastic. So
Great.
again, you are having an innovative product. You are solving on an individual base and in a house really a problem. Can you maybe talk about that a bit more on your experience also in Rwanda and Uganda?
Sure. So I think one of the main reasons that you see such little innovation and innovation at scale in a lot of markets is just the huge number of market failures that exist in housing in particular. So from the fact that often, especially in the markets I work in, the purchasing power of our customers is quite low. And so innovations need to actually meet that price point. They need to be much, much cheaper than concrete. So we are about 80% cheaper than concrete. And even then, our take-up rate is not at 100% at all. So given that, just having to find the funds to innovate for a market that doesn't have a lot of purchasing power is one. Obviously, financing is another thing. Here, people pay for their houses with cash, which is not something that anybody in a developed market will do. Mortgages exist, financing options exist. The Mason network, there's not really an organized system in a lot of places. And then supply chains. I mean, housing is bulky. It's a big product. Roads are bad. In rainy season, it's very difficult for us to get stuff around. And so we have had to figure out how to really hyper locally source materials. So when I say hyper locally, I mean within meters of someone's house, learn how to treat local earth and remove the sand and the clay and basically put it back together in order to build our floors, our earthen floors. So I think because of all those market failures that just make it quite unprofitable at first to really get started until you really build an industry and solve some of these, the role of patient capital is just critical. Because thinking about investing a whole lot of equity into something or a lot of to get a huge loan to be trying to build a brand new industry, quite complicated. But one of the things that's really enabled us to try a lot of things, to test 6 different business models, which we have had to go through before we were actually able to land on something that was genuinely profitable, required that impact investment, basically, to enable us to take risks, to try bold things, and to fail. And because of that flexibility of the kind of capital that we had, I think that's one of the reasons that we've been able to move so fast. Another thing that I think I'm probably most proud of, and I'm proud of a lot of things that have been enabled, but the thing I'm probably most proud of is the fact that we have really leveraged knowledge from the communities that we work in to innovate. We have a district innovation fund, is what we call it, and our floor now looks nothing like the floor that I came to Rwanda thinking we would be building. And that's because as soon as we got there, lots of things didn't work. And then Masons, who know a lot about the materials, were the ones to figure out, okay, let's try this, let's try that. And we therefore have an R&D process that's very decentralized, very flat, and genuinely the best ideas that can come from absolutely any part of our company. And being able to decentralize the innovation process means that you actually are getting the right innovations that you need to take things forward and to really make a significant dent.
Thank you, Gayatri. How can we make sure that the innovations which are now coming out also of the pandemic will also serve low-income households? I mean, you make it, you know, your floors, they are really already towards low-income households, but there are so many innovations they want. How can we really, you know, be inclusive in all our approaches?
I think you need to adapt. I mean, one of the things, so for example, just like I was talking about earlier in the lack of a mortgage market here, to be able to afford an innovation, in a house is a big thing. It's the most expensive asset pretty much anyone in the world owns. So in order to actually afford them, there does need to be some kind of financing available. Of course, as all of you on this panel will know, very difficult to collateralize a house that doesn't have a land title, very difficult to even value that house. There's lots of other things that are required in order to even finance. So these are the types of market failures that I'm talking about, and I think that a lot of the time we see market failures that are solved by collaborations across sectors. You see lots of learnings from each other from different sectors. We have learned a lot from the solar industry, for example, is one way that we can innovate using things that they've already tried and done, like pay-go systems, for example. How can we apply that to housing? In addition to that, I think partnerships are really the key here. So our goal is that, well, what we know for sure is that us as Earthenable can't solve this problem of unhealthy housing, but an industry can solve the problem. So how do we build that industry, and how do we leverage existing players in different countries? So Earthenable is scaling, for example, through a franchise model where we wouldn't go and start up shop in every single new country we want to go to, but instead we open source our technology and we make it available for people to basically replicate our business model in a new context and have the ability to adapt in that new context. So rather than reinventing the wheel in housing, especially in housing, given how complicated the sector is, very important to build on what's already there, build on those foundations, to make a very cheesy pun.
Thank you very much, Gayatri. Charlie, I see you're unmuting.
Yeah,
I just wanted to.
Oh, sorry, what's that?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to build on Gayatri's point there around, like, housing isn't like a shampoo bottle. It's a complicated product. You know, it's like we talk about housing as like, oh, we need to increase the supply of housing, but and sort of like what Samaya said is, you know, there's 27 different stakeholders that in a city to build a new housing unit that have a say. So it's the, you know, the fire department, the building and safety department, the city planning, the mechanical engineer, the, you know, structural engineer, the 2 or 3 contractors that you have, the banker, your wife, if you're building something on your house. Like, I mean, even to build a tiny backyard home in your backyard, you need to get 20 people on the same page. And so I think one of the biggest challenges, it's people problems of like, we have to get either more people out of the equation on building housing, or get all those people that have a say to get on the same page faster. And so there's no other path forward besides that. You have to either get people on the same page so they understand what's going on faster, or get them out of the way. And so I think like one of the weird sort of relationships I've seen in my career is I started my career in private equity and market rate housing with Wells Fargo's commercial real estate group. And what we saw is, you know, these transactions were financed extremely simply. Like we would actually advance 100% acquisition proceeds off a line of credit to buy a hotel to someone that had a high net worth in 30-day closing, right? Like someone can buy basically a hotel on a credit card in 30 days. And then in the affordable housing world, it takes 5 years to cobble together 14 sources of capital. You have to get 55 different people on the same page in order to get one of these things done. Meanwhile, the people that have, you know, so we had sort of an inverse relationship of how many hurdles we put forward, of how many people have a say in making decisions. And we overburden the underserved communities with more of, we say, oh, if we're going to build affordable housing, we have to have 100 people involved, you know, like you have to go on a journey for 5 years and cobble together all the sources of financing. Oh, but if you're rich, you can just buy it on a credit card. So I mean, it's sort of, we have this inverse relationship, I think, of how our pathway to innovation is much harder if you're trying to serve the underserved communities. Oh, sorry. I just want to make that point, is that you have a very high, much higher barriers of entry to serve, you know, sort of the lowest parts of the underserved community market, because, you know, it's overburdened in regulation, overburdened in too many people having a say, and there's not pathways right now that can accelerate implementation very easily. And so I think, you know, that's one of the things that sort of need to be addressed.
Charlie, I think, you know, you would like to add something here.
I would like to add something. This is Sameh. I think what Charlie presented, you know, the overburden of regulations, the number of stakeholders, the sources of financing is definitely a very valid point in places like the US, like Europe, in the places where the formal market works. There's another side of the world where the formal market has not even started working, and access to land becomes a major and structural obstacle in terms of the availability of land, service land, well-located land with tenure security, so that developers can come in and build. And if available, it will be unaffordable and will require, either offering housing solutions for the top 10% of the housing market, or it won't be viable. And then, as Gayatri was saying, I mean, in that side of the world, housing finance markets are not developed. I mean, in a place like Rwanda, where Gayatri is, we're talking about a housing finance market that caters to probably the top 2% of the income distribution. So there's 98% of the population, their ability to access housing will either be via cash solutions, if it's available on the market, or via informal development. So the challenge when you get to that segment where, the 1 billion persons in the developing world that live in slums and informal settlements, they lack tenure security, they lack, water and sanitation infrastructure, they lack, all sorts of public spaces, among others. So it's not surprising that these areas will end up becoming contagion hotspots. And in these places, what you need to be figuring out in terms of solutions is finding ways to bring developers, further down market, getting private sector solutions for this, but also enabling a lot of the dynamics that are happening by the households. Incremental housing, for instance, these are places where people, acquire building materials over time so that they can build gradually. How can you harness that? How can you formalize the informal? How can you reduce also the regulatory burden? Just because, there are laws, but nobody implements those laws. So I think, that notion of figuring out how to embrace, tackle, and learn from informality, incrementalism, etc., to get a dynamic going, and bring housing solutions to the base of the pyramid in one side of the world, and in the other side of the world, lowering the regulatory burden and, if you will, streamlining the amount of transaction costs that make, a housing start take 5 years to completion, just like Charlie said. Thanks.
Thank you, Sami. For example, in TCIS, also with our shelter tech work we are doing, we are trying also to bring innovations or innovators, startups and scale-ups to this market, to the affordable housing market, to the low-income households. And it is quite hard, right? The policies and regulations, the support system don't support yet or accelerate yet the startups with their needs. Sami, again, like, how do you feel in these parts of the world? What else can we do to boost these innovations on the various parts of the value chain?
So for the innovations, you've got both, innovations on the supply side, but you need to also start thinking on innovation on the demand side as well. So innovation on the demand side, I guess microfinance would be one of the most important ways of figuring out ways of bringing housing finance solutions to, if you will, an unbanked population. Innovation on the titling side that will both help the tenure security, enable the transaction in property without there being risk or transaction costs, but also providing that security that will enable a housing mortgage market to develop. You can use lots of technical innovations in terms of drones and other forms of technology that would enable the creation of those base maps that could bring, if you will, that spatial dimension of surveys. But you'll also need maybe community involvement so that you can have solutions in terms of the adjudication of property rights. Then on the housing supply side, again, there's lots of innovations that you're all familiar with on the construction side, but I think the most important two dimensions that are missing to lower the cost of housing supply, are streamlining building and planning regulations, because if all what you can build on the land is 1 time the land, if you have a floor area ratio of 1 in a central location, then it doesn't matter how efficiently and how cheaply you build if you can't leverage the land value and build efficiently in terms of density, then you're losing something. And of course, access to land in terms of whether it's public land or private land whose tenure security can enable the market to function better. So I think you need, again, innovation along the entire value chain, as I was trying to say a little bit earlier. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you so much. We're talking now again about the past, historical intersections, the future, the present. We're talking about housing and low-income housing, and in a holistic approach as well. I would like to focus again on the individuals, and I think, Andre, you have a current project. You are focusing on the individual, on the lives, on the individual with thousands of pictures. Can you please talk more about that?
Sure. So, as Gayatri was saying, it turns out that people know more about their lives than we do, right? And they have the knowledge about what actually can work for them. So, one of the things that we became interested, or we recognize, is that most of the developments that we have they respond to some of the logic or to modern logic that came from the economic scale, right? So predicting a lot, making faster, cheaper, large scale, where patterns of daily life were actually stable, right? We knew that the future would be very similar to the past. People had less channels and alternatives to actually carve a different future for themselves than they have today. But we continue to assume that patterns of daily lives are stable. So with the pandemic, we realized that we didn't even know what questions we should be asking. Just because people are in their homes or there'll be shelter in place, that doesn't mean they're living the same life that we are. So what we did is the whole life initiative looks at try to understand how can we help individuals and organizations be better prepared to fight the pandemics of tomorrow. But then we ask, what can we learn about individuals, people's behavior, as well as organizations' behavior today? And how can we think about narratives that actually capture how people are actually experiencing? So the whole life has 3 interconnected but independent projects: Remember Now, Sketch Tomorrow, and Prototype Future. So Remember Now is the story about 20 faculty from more than 15 countries work together with more than 200 students to collect photos about how people are living, learning, working, and playing, and how these activities got enhanced or disrupted by the pandemic. So we asked people to document their daily lives, and then we had a follow-up interview with them asking, why to take this photo? Tell me more. We're not necessarily interested in the photos, but rather the stories behind the photos, and actually capturing personal stories and try to understand the experiences to try to figure out what questions were actually relevant to people, not to the organizations trying to serve them, not to the markets that they represent, but actually to people. These are key stakeholders in defining the occupation and the future of actually how we should actually be living. So right now, we are in the process of extracting meaningful variables and correlations between them in these stories and aggregating them. What we are doing is we are treating this new approach as an initiative that captures population level behavior, which is fairly new, from people's activities, not from questioning. Those are different things. And creating a methodology that allows us to use this evidence to create criteria for new ideas that can be implemented now. There are different insights coming at different levels, but I think that one of the interesting ones is that we're about to enter a 21st century war. And that war is between, on one side, we have data, information, and on the other side have meaning. And there's a huge gap between these two pieces, right? Data is gathered and controlled by organizations who gather the data today, right? And they're used to produce information that are centered around the interest of the producer. The meaning is owned and controlled by the receiver. Now, think about with me for a moment. We have think about a triangle where we have three stakeholders: government, research labs, and the public. The channels between government and the public are fairly formal. Vocabulary and language between them is fairly clear. So folks at Harvard know how to talk to folks with World Bank, CDC, and etc. and others around. Now, government and the public, the channels are less structured. In fact, when the public try to find policies, it's very hard to find a policy. And when we do find it, they're written in technical terms by and for the expertise of those who write. It's very hard for the public to make sense of it. Now, the government keeps getting data that it's relevant to the government, right? Census data and etc. Perhaps one that it's important for people is the 911 services when there is one. And then the relationship between research labs and the public is even more problematic, right? So we have people answering questionnaires and participating researchers that are relevant to the research labs. So what happens is at the age of social media, people turn to channels that are easy to use and with clear information, easy to access, but content being generated by sources like QAnon and conspiracy theories that help people make sense, even though the information might be false, right? So the question that generates is what a social utility for meaning will look like that strengthen the relationship between government, research labs, and the public in a way that we actually can accelerate the relationship between these stakeholders, but in a way that it's actually meaningful to the people, to the public as well, not only to these stakeholders, right? So that's some of these things that we are thinking about this, right? The other logic that emerges from this analysis is, how much of our siloed organizations or our policies and processes have been defined by the logic of the 8-hour shift. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours for you, right? That emerged at the same time as the Crystal Palace and all of that, right? We have developed a system of things to support silo understanding of people's lives, but today is much more overlapping, right? We don't have systems that serve that intersection, right? Graduates at the Illinois Institute of Technology, the Institute of Design that we're working, they came to the insight that with the pandemic, we became geographically bounded and grounded, but also we realized that many of us were geographically lost. We knew nothing about the person living next door, right? And I understand that that's very different from the conditions and the neighborhoods in informal settlements or in the developing world. Still, there are many, many, many situations where that's true, where housing gets implemented, or even housing is a factor that actually supports this, right? There's this connection, the deconstruction of an existing social fabric. So what a system will look like to support those intersections of learning, living, working, and playing, right? These are things that we get to the structural piece of the relationship between different stakeholders and help us in moments like this. It's important for us to prototype the future rather than benchmark the past. Speed, scale, and scope are all big, but that doesn't mean we need to start there, right? So thinking about ways to start small, learn fast, and scale up what is actually relevant and meaningful. It's a way to go and figure out new models of scalability. Gayatri was saying, it's not about scaling up the impact by scaling up the organization, but rather creating impact at scale is different than creating scale of impact, right? Being able to codify your practice, making it easier for others to adopt as they see fit to the context, is different than dominating and determining a way that by now we know that will not work for everyone.
Thank you very much, Andre. I think that was a great closing word, also saying prototyping the future now. I also heard a lot about like innovation along the entire value chain and breaking silos. Thank you so much. I have one very, very short question for all of you. Please reply in maximum 3 words. So housing past pandemic is or will be. Sameh.
Green, resilient, and inclusive.
Thank you. Gayatri.
Healthy for everyone.
Andre.
Yet to be determined.
Charlie. You're mute.
Proactive, inclusive, and creative.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the 4 of you. Thank you also very much to the audience. It was a great conversation despite the technical issues in various parts of the discussion. Thank you very much. I mean, the pandemic has had a significant impact on all our lives, with the Delta and other variants continuing to spread and less than 30% of the global population vaccinated. We know the pandemic is far from over, but we are hopeful for recovery that brings new innovations and ultimately leads to a healthier and more resilient housing, also long term. For anyone out there who is interested in learning more about Habitat for Humanity's Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter and our work to support entrepreneurs and startups, please also visit habitat.org. Thank you again very, very much for being part of this Plus U discussion, and hope to see you at the next one.
Thank you.